Shaping Crimea's future, a referendum on whether the peninsula will join Russia is only worsening an already tense situation. The international community is threatening Moscow with sanctions, but will sanctions work? What does this referendum mean for Ukraine? And why does Crimea matter? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Jane Dutton. The people of Crimea vote on their future in a referendum to decide whether they'll rejoin Russia. It takes place as pro-Russian troops control the region. Moscow says the vote is both free and legitimate, but that view isn't shared by Kiev, the European Union and the United States. They've previously threatened sanctions against Russia if the vote went ahead. Jackie Rowland sent us this report from Crimea.
This referendum was very hastily organised. They didn't even have a proper electoral register from Kiev, as a result of which they had incomplete voting lists, sometimes had to fill in the gaps themselves. Some people said they didn't receive their voting cards. Other people said that they'd received voting cards for members of the family who had died in recent years. But despite this slight air of disorganisation, there's no doubting the enthusiasm for people to take part in this vote. Everyone we spoke to said that it was like a holiday mood. They were very enthusiastic, and certainly there were long lines of people from first thing in the morning, even before the voting stations opened, and throughout the day. The questions now are what will happen next if in fact the referendum does produce the expected outcome. What would be the modalities for switching over to a Crimea under Russian rule? Technical questions like currency, like who would own state assets, who would pay pensions and salaries, all of these questions have still to be answered, and it would doubtless be weeks, if not months, before the whole system would be working efficiently under the rule of Russia, if indeed that is the outcome of the vote.
Well, let's bring in our guests. From Kiev, Mikhailo Winitsky, Associate Professor at Kiev Mohyla Academy. And from Moscow, Vyacheslav Matuzov, former Russian diplomat in Washington. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. Let me start off with you, Mikhailo. How is this referendum being viewed from Kiev?
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, everybody understands that it's not a legitimate referendum, that it's not legitimate to ask people to vote when they're facing the barrel of a gun. Certainly we know that there's a very large portion of the Crimean population that sees itself as being closer to Russia than it does to Ukraine. That's been obvious for the last 20 years. It's nothing new here. But I think a lot of people in Kiev would like to see a much more legitimate way of either separating the country or at least creating some more autonomy. The fact is that Russia has attacked Ukraine. The fact is that Ukraine has been in basically a state of war, although restraining itself from actual shooting since February 27th. And I think people realize that it's about to get much, much hotter because the Russian regime is certainly not going to be stopping at Ukraine. There's a lot of people in Kiev who believe that within the next, let's say, 6 to 10 days, we will be seeing an invasion of territorial Ukraine in addition to Crimea. In other words, it's far from being over yet.
Right, you raise many points. Let me pick up on the referendum. What do you make of the questions, the fact that it is a case of do you want to join Russia now or Russia later?
Well, again, look, the referendum is a farce. I mean, there's no two ways about it. You don't call a referendum, you don't prepare for a referendum within 2 weeks. As many have stated, the electoral lists have not been accurate. We have cases where it's been reported today with actual interviews of people showing Russian passports and being allowed to vote. In other words, it's not just limited to the Ukrainian population or the Ukrainian citizens. We have a scenario where the Crimean Tatars, Crimea is actually their ancestral homeland. They have boycotted the referendum because they're understanding that it's not going to be something that's going to be free and fair. You don't hold a referendum like this without any international observers. In other words, I mean, we're in a scenario where certainly this is obviously a news story, but at the end of the day, the legality is certainly very, very questionable.
Vyacheslav, a farce there, a precursor to war, is that what this referendum is all about? And are those in the Kremlin high-fiving each other, the fact that this has gone ahead so quickly?
Well, Russia considered that illegal authorities are in Kiev because they came to the power by coup d'etat, and that's why we have I think that Russian leadership doesn't pay a lot of attention to the reaction of Kiev, but they paid real attention to the will of Crimean population, because about 2 million of population, it is not much, but we cannot blame Crimeans that they are using Russian passports. Why? Because we cannot principally influenced by some Russian persons who can vote somewhere in the, maybe it occurred, but it is single cases, not an all, because 2 million of population vote against authorities in Kiev. Because it is the problem not of Russian policy.
The question is not whether they like the authorities in Kiev. That's not what's on the ballot. What's on the ballot is not whether you like the authorities in Kiev. And quite frankly, the fact of legitimacy or illegitimacy of the Ukrainian government in Kiev is completely irrelevant to the discussion. The question on the ballot, which is being placed in the context of having 15 or 18 or 20,000 troops heavily armed from Russia on Ukrainian soil, you have a scenario of that being called a legitimate referendum. Of course that's not legitimate. When you ask somebody to make a choice at the barrel of a gun, that's not legitimate, and it's completely irrelevant whether or not the Ukrainian government in Kiev came to power in a coup d'etat or whether it came to power in an election. You're mixing apples and oranges. You have absolutely there's two different stories.
Well,
if you want to talk about
we can talk about a lot of fantasies. We can talk a lot of fantasies about presence of Russian army in Crimea, in some regions in South Ukraine.
Oh, so you're saying that the Russian army is not in Crimea? So you're saying that the Russian army is not in Crimea? There are no Russian troops in Crimea, right?
Is location in Sevastopol according to agreement.
Right.
And I don't hear anything.
Okay. So the fact that we have
I'm going to jump in there quickly, Vasyslav. I mean, the international viewpoint is that Russia has exceeded the amount of troops that it is allowed in Crimea under certain international agreements. And I know from speaking to my correspondents on the ground, our correspondents on the ground, that Russian troops are there. Russian troops are evident in all forms.
Jane, not only are Russian troops in Crimea, it's the same thing as saying that, look, there are Russian troops in Sevastopol. There's nothing wrong with that. Russia has an agreement with Kiev to rent a certain amount of territory to lease a military base. That's the same thing as the United States leases a military base in Guantanamo. However, we have the equivalent of having American troops in Havana. That's not part of the deal. When you have Russian troops in places like Bakhchisarai, places like Kerch.
We cannot compare such kind of things. I'm sorry. We cannot compare such kind of things because not Russia is responsible for Ukrainian disturbances. Let's begin from the zero. Who reacted in Ukraine? Who brought these disturbances to this scale? I think it is American policy.
No one. You attacked us. You attacked us. You invaded.
That was reaction of population.
You invaded.
And
you invaded.
Russia cannot.
You invaded. You invaded.
Not me.
You
not
invaded
us.
The sovereign territory of Ukraine.
McCain.
Okay, I think this is a pretty good time to take us back to how come we got to be in this situation. The current crisis goes back to November. That's when Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych abandoned a trade agreement with the EU for closer ties with Moscow. That triggered months of protests in Kiev that climaxed on February the 20th, when 70 people were killed by government snipers who opened fire on protesters. 2 days later, Ukrainian politicians voted to remove the president, who then fled Kiev after protesters took control of the capital. Almost immediately, pro-Russian protesters rallied in Crimea against the new administration in Kiev. And in late February, armed men in unmarked combat fatigues seized the regional parliament and government buildings in Crimea. By the beginning of March, pro-Russian troops had taken over Crimea without firing a shot. And in his first public remarks on the Ukrainian crisis, Russian President Vladimir Putin said his country reserved the right to use all means to protect its citizens in eastern Ukraine. Let's bring in from Simferopol, the capital of Kiev, Srdja Trifkovic, foreign affairs editor for Chronicles magazine. Tell us how you have seen this referendum playing out today and what people have been saying about it and the importance.
Well, as usual, when you come to a crisis hotspot from the outside world, things seem much more normal than they're supposed to be. I have visited several voting places, mainly in schools, and early in the morning there were mainly babushkas and grandpas queuing up. Families and younger people came later on. But there was no adrenaline, there was no sense of urgency, and most certainly there were no armed men of any kind, least of all Russian policemen or military personnel. The overall mood is that they're doing what they feel is their duty to what they regard as the ultimate objective, which is to make sure that the Crimean Peninsula becomes part of the Russian Federation. Regardless of what the international community or the group of nations calling itself the international community says or does, these people are determined not to be part of Ukraine ever again.
And talk us through why there is, amongst a certain part of the population, this desire to break away from Ukraine. What do those in Crimea believe that they can get from Russia that they haven't been getting from Ukraine? What promises were they given?
Well, first of all, most citizens of the Crimean Peninsula were not separatists during the past 23 years of Ukraine's independent existence. They, in fact, functioned reasonably well as an autonomous republic within the Ukrainian state. However, the events in Kiev over the past 3 months to them are most alarming because they see that extreme nationalists with undoubtedly pro-fascist or proto-fascist tendencies from the Western Ukraine have gained the upper hand in Kiev, that the replacement of President Yanukovych happened by unconstitutional and what they regard as distinctly extra-constitutional means, that there is now a putschist government in Kiev that is trying to impose a vision of Ukrainian identity that is not only alien to the Russian speakers and to those Ukrainians who feel close to Russia, but that is openly and overtly hostile to them, that in fact the Western Ukrainian vision of Ukrainian identity postulates Russophobia as the basic pillar of its own self. So to the denizens of Crimea, it is not a matter of what Russia can offer that Ukraine didn't offer. It's really an existential, cultural and moral issue that goes beyond economics, quite apart from the fact
bring in Michael.
that Russia...
Are these fears justified? I mean, I know you'll probably disagree with every single point there, but these people who are voting to break away from Ukraine feel that their lives and their lifestyle in some way or another is under threat.
Look, the reality is that in the polling results that were, a poll was conducted in Crimea just before the ouster of Yanukovych at the height of all of the violence that was happening in Kiev. At that time, 41% of Crimeans said that they wanted to join Russia, approximately 40% of Crimeans said that they wanted to stay in Ukraine, and approximately 20% were undecided. Now, in that, it is definitely a divided society. Is there any justification to the fact that there are supposedly some sort of nationalist putschists running around in Kiev? Well, look, nationalist putschists don't generally, or fascists, as was said by my colleague, don't generally appoint heads of the Jewish community in Ukraine to posts of governorships. They don't generally appoint Russian speakers to the post of Minister of the Interior. They don't I mean, what we're talking about is the continuation of Russian propaganda, which is trying to show that apparently there is this really right-wing separatist or fascist government in Kiev. In actual fact, who the nationalist or who the fascist is in this particular case is Putin. I mean, we're talking about somebody who's being expansionist, and he's not protecting Russian citizens, which would probably be actually legal and legitimate. He's protecting Russian speakers. Well, the last time we heard that kind of an argument for invasion was Sudetenland and Hitler. I mean,
let me put that to Vyacheslav. Let's find out. Let's try and find out what Putin's objectives are as far as Crimea is concerned and Ukraine. What's he going to do?
I think that Russia doesn't have no intention to spoil its relations with Ukrainian people at all, at least. And now there arose new issue that current Kiev authority are beginning to fight extremist, fascist groups in Kiev and surrounding. But I think they are too weak to overcome all those people. Anyhow, any discussion on future Ukraine today will be outside of the fate of Crimea. Crimea, many people in Moscow consider it as a big gift from Barack Obama to Vladimir Putin for Barack Obama's bad policy, strategic mistakes in Ukraine. And the reward for Putin is from Barack Obama is Crimea issue. Not Crimea was the goal of Russian policy. Not Crimea was intended Russia to join the Russian territory. It is policy of the United States that pushed people in Crimea to demand persistently from Moscow to join Russia.
Okay, so Russia, in response to that, has almost doubled their presence there. They're massing on the borders with Ukraine. What are the intentions? Is Putin going to go for Ukraine next?
Well, right now we have relations. Today, John Kerry twice called Sergei Lavrov during one day. They are in intensive discussion how to find way out in this crisis, because crisis is unacceptable. So they speak today not about Crimea. Crimea, it is solved issue. We cannot return back to it. That now question is
Jane,
about
I'd like to jump in here if you don't mind.
About southern and eastern region.
Okay, Michael, what are you going to say?
That was the issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the first statement was that Russia has no intention of breaking off its relations with Ukraine. The fact is that Russia has already broken all diplomatic relations with Ukraine. Ukrainians have, the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has tried to set...
Till now, embassies are
the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has tried to sit down at the table with Sergei Lavrov. Sergei Lavrov has decided to ignore that. Sergei Lavrov has ignored the request of the... Okay,
I'm
so
going to move this on,
what we're talking about right now is
Vyacheslav,
that the fate of Ukraine is
again.
going to be decided by Lavrov and Kerry, and that I think is objectionable. I mean, the fate of Ukraine cannot be decided by Lavrov and Kerry. This is an independent country that needs to have a voice, and if the Russians decide that they want to,
Kharkov, voice Odessa, voice Dnipropetrovsk, or voice only Dmitry Yarosh.
Okay, Michael, what I want to know is
it
such a big deal for Ukraine to lose Crimea? I mean, what is it holding on for here?
We're not, look, the fact is that Ukraine is not actually holding on. If you look at it, Ukraine has been extremely restrained. There's an awful lot of Ukrainian troops on Crimean soil, and not a single shot has been fired. They have been surrounded, they've been threatened, there's been ultimatums put out by the Russian troops, and yet at the same time, the Ukrainians are holding out and not firing. They are under strict instructions, do not fire unless you are fired upon. The Russians have been trying to provoke them.
Interesting to know who they swear allegiance to now, or who they have to show allegiance to.
Well, the reality is that the Ukrainian troops will probably have to be evacuated, but there is a difference between Crimea and territorial Ukraine. And what people in Kiev are talking about right now is a very, very serious fear. We fear that we will be attacked. Territorial Ukraine will be attacked within the next 6 to 10 days. And no diplomatic relations between John Kerry and Mr. Lavrov are actually going to help
Is
that.
that
There
going to
needs to be
happen,
the direct
Vacheslav?
dialogue between the two countries.
It is disinformation fully and completely. We cannot even hear about it. Russia doesn't have any intention to invade Ukraine. Forget about this. Forget.
Okay, I'm
Ukraine
going
has
to
already
bring
been invaded by Russia.
I'm going to bring in Srdja here. Let's talk about the promises that have been made to those in the Crimea, if they do indeed go with Russia. I mean, what do people expect they're going to get? Will their lives improve? And how will Simferopol deal with this relationship with Russia if indeed the referendum goes that way? What happens, for example, to Crimea's state assets? Who's going to pay the pensioners? That sort of thing.
Well, these are extremely important questions. My impression, and I've spoken to quite a few people of different age groups, is that they are far less interested in the tangible material benefits of association with Russia and much more in what one might call emotional and spiritual as well as political aspects of being safe in being who you are, preserving your identity, and being able to maintain the dynamics of a coherent community. So even if...
Is it a case of that they must be careful what they ask for?
Well, in the long term, I think that to most Crimean Russians who... By the way, I dispute the findings of the so-called opinion poll, because if the vote in the Crimea was more or less even between those in favor and those against, we certainly would have seen some form of social protest or resistance to what is going on. But again, having seen various
I would suggest that you go to a
referenda...
Tatar village. Try to go to a Tatar's community. Try to go to Bakhchisarai. Try to go to some places where...
Having seen...
What happens to the Tatars? I mean, that's a fair point. They certainly don't want Crimea to break away.
Having seen various referenda in the former Yugoslavia in the 90s, I already know that for most people who feel strongly committed to a particular point of view, the economic prospects or what one might term material or tangible quantitative aspects of the issue are far less important than the affective and emotional aspects of being the master of one's own destiny, or at least what people hope will turn out to be that way. Something radically different has happened to Crimea and to Ukraine over the past 3 months compared to either the Orange Revolution of 2004 or to the period of the Ukrainian independence between 1991 and January of this year. And that change is not the result of any short-term state of play on Kiev's social and political scene. It is the result of the change of the fundamental mood.
Okay, can I put the last question, if I may, sorry, to Mykolov, because obviously it seems almost like that this is a done deal, that there is an aspiration and a commitment to head towards Russia after this referendum. What's Kiev's next step?
Preparing for refugees. That's the basic thing that we're talking about at the moment. We have 300 families that have already been evacuated, or rather have evacuated themselves from Crimea. They are Crimean Tatars who have moved onto Ukrainian territory. We are expecting an inflow of upwards of 100 and 150,000 refugees over the next month or so. Perhaps it'll take a little longer, but the point is that there will be a movement of people northward. Effectively, we're looking at ethnic cleansing in Crimea. Crimea will become an ethnically Russian territory in addition to becoming de facto part of Russia. Whether that will be actually
Nicola, I'm going to have to jump in here and cut you off. I'm sorry, we have run out of time. But Mikola Witnitsky with those final words, Srdja Trifkovic and Vyacheslav Matuzov, thank you very much for talking to us on Inside Story. Fascinating subject. Just remember, if you want to watch the show again or tell anyone about it, you can find the show and many more on our website. Just follow the links for shows and Inside Story. I'm Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye for now.